Coming up on The Daily with me, Niall Paterson, bye Biden. As he prepares to leave political office after 50 years of public service, how will Joe Biden be remembered?
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
He was the youngest person ever to have a seat in the Senate. He is the oldest ever occupant of the Oval Office. After more than 5 decades in politics, Joe Biden's career comes to an end after 4 years at the very top as the 46th President of the United States. He's been a politician, in fact, for a fifth of the US's very existence. But it all comes to an end Monday when Donald Trump takes over. So just how will he be remembered?
It will take time to feel the full impact of all we've done together. But the seeds are planted, and they'll grow and they'll bloom for decades to come. At home, we've created nearly 17 million new jobs, more than any other single administration, a single term. More people have health care than ever before. And overseas, we've strengthened NATO. Ukraine is still free, and so much more. I'm so proud of how much we've accomplished together for the American people.
Well, look, that's how he wishes to be thought of. But will he? Our US correspondent Mark Stone is in Washington. Mark, that farewell address from the Oval Office a few days ago, what did you make of it?
Well, to start with, Neil, it wasn't what we had all expected. I think the expectation was that we would see a man who was frustrated, a man who believed that the American people did not recognize what he sees as his many successes, and that he would effectively list his greatest hits and say, look, this is what I did. I did this, I did this, I did this. Yes, there was a list of what he sees as his greatest hits, but that was kind of a side note. What he did over about 15 minutes, just under, in the Oval Office, with that, backdrop and with that phrase that they open with that kind of makes Americans sit up, he hopes, and listen. My fellow Americans, he began. What he did was to issue a kind of siren song to America about the dangers that he sees ahead of him. And one word for me stuck out: oligarchy. He says that America is now becoming an oligarchy. And in a sense, what he did was to extend the argument that he's made for quite a few years now, that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. Now he's extending that in this farewell moment and saying that not just him, but the people he has surrounded himself with are actually a danger to democracy in America. And he's talking about Elon Musk.
Yeah, well, one wonders what he could have done during his 4 years as president to perhaps guard against the prospect of an oligarchy taking shape. But let's run ourselves through, Joe Biden's greatest hits. And I suppose one place where you can point a finger and say, yeah, well done, was the COVID vaccine rollout.
Yeah, although that rollout began under the Trump presidency. But Biden, under the first couple of years of Biden, I mean, let's remember he was dealt a proper hospital pass from the fallout of COVID. The American economy was in a terrible state, just like the world economy. And yet he managed to turn it around remarkably quickly. And if you fast forward to the point where we are at now, the American economy is the envy of the world. Job numbers are at record highs. And all of this, Biden should take a huge amount of credit for. But as became clear in the election, perception and reality are two different things. And people didn't recognize that the economy was doing so well. People tend not to look beyond their shores and see that things are pretty rough elsewhere, and you may be lucky to be an American. And it didn't serve him well in the election. But it is a clear, demonstrable success. The COVID recovery, the vaccine rollout, and more broadly, the economic recovery from COVID.
What of you have to say his support for Ukraine. I mean, there have been issues getting money from the United States to Ukraine at times, but his public support has certainly been unwavering.
The way he dealt with the Ukraine crisis, I think, is certainly seen by many as one of his successes, certainly in the early days. Remember that before Russia invaded Ukraine, it was almost America alone that was saying, this is going to happen. Our intelligence suggests that Putin is going to invade Ukraine. And most countries were like, yeah, no, it's not going to happen. Even Ukraine didn't believe that it was going to happen. And yet Biden was saying, you've got to get ready. It is going to happen. And so it did. And after that, he managed to build and hold a remarkable coalition of Western nations. He strengthened NATO, and he very carefully managed the conflict, he would argue, not putting American boots on, or NATO boots on the ground, but allowing Ukraine to hold its own and to fight back against Russia. Now, the counter-argument, which gets stronger as the years went on, is that actually all he did was allow Ukraine the ability to hold the line but not to win, and that he prolonged a war that he could otherwise have pushed harder on and perhaps helped Ukraine to win. But 2020 hindsight vision is a useful thing.
Yeah, but more than that, latterly, hasn't Joe Biden come to be criticised by ultimately by all sides, by Ukraine supporters, for not giving them the most advanced technology that he can, and by the isolationists for so directly involving the United States in someone else's war?
Yeah, but the alternative, he would argue, is World War III, and that he actually, over the past 4 years, has helped avoid a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia, precisely because he has been so cautious and careful in providing just the right amount of weapons to be able to hold the line. He would make the point, and he has done, to degrade Russia's military massively over time, but to avoid an all-out global war.
And what of those seeds that have been planted that will bloom for decades to come? The infrastructure bill, which, you've got to say, I mean, Joe Biden himself might not live to see all the achievements that stem from that.
He definitely won't live to see all the achievements that stem from that, because they are going to take a long time.
Just remind us, Mark, what was this infrastructure bill?
It is the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA. And it was $1.2 trillion
Wow.
Dedicated to infrastructure initiatives. It was a bipartisan bill passed, and it was historic in nature. And in a sense, it kind of reflected Joe Biden's abilities to be able to get people from different political hues on side, to compromise, to come together and push something massive across the line. And they did. And it's basically rebuilding a crumbling America. But of course, that takes time. And I guess that's one reason why it was so hard for him to win the election, because he can point to something that hasn't yet happened, which is a pretty hard thing to tell people to vote for. And it is going to take time. I mean, enacting legislation and realizing what it can do are two very different things. One is easier than the other.
Yeah, but again, Joe Biden has been lamenting the fact that, his name hasn't been so closely attached to many of the projects that will flow from this incredible amount of expenditure, which I have to say is somewhat surprising to me for a politician of 50 years standing in the Capitol not to know how to do the PR.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think, as Team Biden packs up the White House and heads home, they will reflect on that. And I think that will be one thing that they think they failed on, the PR, the messaging, that they failed adequately enough to explain to the American people that actually he did some pretty remarkable things.
Well, let's pivot, as the Americans say, to the things that went wrong. And top of the list, Afghanistan. I mean, that was an absolute disaster.
Yes, to remind people, it was, in fact, something that Donald Trump in his first presidency had said he wanted to do, to get troops out of Afghanistan to end that war. But then it was carried out by Joe Biden. The implementation of that policy was, as you say, a complete disaster. Remember those images of the American C-17s taking off from the airport in Kabul and Afghans running down the runway after those planes. Some of them managed to climb on and then falling off as the planes left the runway. I mean, it was Vietnam all over again. It was absolutely terrible. And without question, it was an early material failure of Joe Biden.
Now, Mark, for all the talk that the US economy is the envy of the world, I mean, one of the central issues that led to Donald Trump taking over from Joe Biden, was the economy, was the cost of goods, and inflation has been a bit of a flaming tire around Joe Biden's neck.
Yeah, but he's in the same boat as everyone there. And I think you could argue that actually he got it back under control, just not quite in time. I mean, I remember reading commentary 7-8 months ago from policy wonks here in America who said, look, if Joe Biden can get inflation under control by sort of September, October of 2024, then he's got a chance of winning the election, that is. But he didn't quite do it in time. At least it takes time for the economic reality and the economic perception to meet. And although on paper things were a lot better, it didn't feel like that in people's back pockets. And if there is one single issue on which Biden lost the election, I think it is the perception of how wealthy people felt that they were and how much the cost of living was.
And what of the wrinkly elephant in the room, Joe Biden's age?
Yeah, look, I think that will be seen as a huge issue, one that, in fact, the American media didn't grasp early enough. I've always been struck at how deferential the American media is to the presidency. And on this issue, that became a problem because certainly the liberal media were not willing to question his clear cognitive decline. And when they did, it was kind of too late for him to step aside and pass the baton to someone else. There are so many instances where he's kind of just messed things up, got things wrong, done things that elderly people tend to do. When he was giving his statement about the Gaza ceasefire, he referred to the Emir of Qatar as the Emir of Kuwait. And he talked about Hezbollah when he should have been talking about Hamas. I mean, these are forgivable little things, but he's the president of the United States. And even on this key day, key moment, right at the end of his presidency, he was still tripping up on things.
I can understand the with hindsight hand-wringing that is going on amongst the Democrats that didn't tell him to go sooner, amongst the liberal media that didn't report a story that was clearly a story. But what of his own culpability? What of his own responsibility? I mean, if you're president of the United States and you're getting things wrong, perhaps you yourself should say, do you know what, guys? Maybe I shouldn't be running for a second term. That's on him.
Hubris, Neil. That's what it is. He didn't recognize it. It's also an important point to make that he did shift in his views. I mean, remember, when he came to office, he always made out that he was a bridge away from Trump to a younger generation. And although he never actually said it explicitly, it was implicit in everything that he did in those early years, that he would only serve one term and that he would hand the baton to a younger generation, and that person would be Kamala Harris. But he thought he was going to be a bridge away from Trump, that somehow Trump was a sort of presidential anomaly. But it turned out that maybe he was the anomaly. He was the interregnum between two Trump presidencies. Maybe that is going to be his legacy. Franklin Foer is one of Biden's biographers. And shortly after the election, he said, Biden will be remembered for paving the way for the return of Donald Trump. That is his legacy. Everything else is an asterisk, which was, damning indeed. But I wonder, and I think Joe Biden would certainly hope, that legacies are not set in the moment. They're cemented long after. And I think Joe Biden's hope, and certainly the message that he wanted to leave the world, was kind of wait and see. I've got warnings about what I think might happen. And I suppose he thinks his legacy is that those warnings will turn out to be right.
Thanks, Mark. So, why do presidents seem so all-consumed by their legacy? Find out next. So let's consider for a second exactly why legacy is such a big deal. Dr. Larry Cook is a presidential historian who's written a number of books on the office. Larry, why specifically are US presidents so consumed by legacy?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons there. Number one, the U.S. presidency is like the pinnacle of a politician's career. So, what have you got beyond that, really, besides your legacy? I think the other thing is that an American president knows that their legacy is going to be studied for forever, for as long as America's here. We're still looking at George Washington's legacy, Abraham Lincoln's, Thomas Jefferson's. I think any American president realizes that millions of people around the world are going to study their legacy. And of course, we all want people to think good things of us, and especially an American president with all that they've either done in office or tried to do in office.
So how does a president fashion a legacy?
I would say most American presidents try to cement their legacy by doing what they feel is right at the time, keeping the interests of America and the interests of the world at heart when they're making decisions. Of course, there's many things that happen in America as well as other countries around the world that's out of a leader's control. Inflation, for example, is not always in the control of the president at the time, or natural disasters, man-made disasters, things like that. But I think that they try to cement their legacy by doing what they feel is right.
So what then do you make of the way in which Joe Biden's presidency has served to shape the way that people will remember him?
I think he's going to have a tough time having a great legacy, just with the things that have happened in his presidency, the way that he was running for president and the way he left the race. His age is definitely a factor for him that will be discussed forever. He came in as a president vowing to unite, and I'm not sure that he really accomplished the unity thing as much as he stated early on.
It would be remiss of me, of course, with a presidential historian on the podcast, for me not to ask you, who do you compare him to in your mind?
There's been comparisons made to him with Lyndon Johnson, and mainly that's with his decision to get out of the race, like Lyndon Johnson did in 1968, where everybody expected him to run, and then it turned out that he didn't. With his age, we were talking about his age, and back in the 1840s, William Henry Harrison, he was elected president at, I think it was 68, 69 years old, which back then people were talking about, wow, that's old to be elected president. I think President Biden would like to be compared to Jimmy Carter in a way, with his focus on energy programs, things like that. So for different reasons, I think you could compare him to several different presidents, as you could most presidents.
Just reflecting on the speech that Biden gave in the Oval Office this week, he was claiming that he had planted seeds that will be blooming for decades to come, whilst holding my hands up and admitting that you haven't yet written the history book. Do you think he might have a point there?
I think a lot of his policies and laws that were enacted in his agenda were not formed to have an immediate legacy with it. I think a lot of the things that he did will have to wait years to see. Microchips, infrastructure, what he's done to help with the global warming issue. Again, not something that's going to happen immediately. Economic measures that he took to reduce inflation. Are those measures that he enacted going to, down the road into Trump's term, help the economy? May very well. We'll have to wait and see.
Can presidents, in the aftermath of their time in the Oval Office, serve to change the way that they will be remembered?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go back to my good friend Jimmy Carter. He is he's the model for that. Jimmy Carter and I were friends for a little over 20 years. He's a very good friend. And the Jimmy Carter that you saw doing things throughout the world was the Jimmy Carter that I knew. The best way to describe him is a man of faith and principles. His faith guided him before he got into the White House. It guided him in the White House, and it guided him afterwards. He had the longest post-term presidency of any president in American history, of like 43 years. So, and he certainly, as I said, he's the example of a president coming out of the White House and deciding to do good with his life. And, he started the Carter Center, which has done global efforts all over the world to fight disease and wage peace. With Biden's age, it's a little tough. I think when Jimmy Carter came out of the White House, he was 57, I believe. President Biden coming out of the White House at 82, I think he is. You don't have a lot of time to do that.
Well, I'm very sorry for the loss of your friend, Larry, but you spoke very warmly about him. But to bring it back to Joe Biden, would Joe Biden be remembered better had he not been president?
I think he would have had probably a better legacy but maybe not as well known of a legacy. And what I mean by that is he had 50 years of serving the public. I mean, he came in as a 30-year-old senator, was elected even before he was 30. Right there, that's a pretty remarkable accomplishment, and spent all that time in the Senate and then became vice president. And so I think it's admirable for anyone, whether you like their politics or you don't. It's admirable for anyone to have served 50 years in public service.
Dr. Larry Cook, many thanks.
Thank you, sir.
And that's your lot for this week on The Daily. Lots to look forward to next week as we launch Trump 100, a new podcast covering the first 100 days of his presidency. Stay tuned for that. We will see you then. Have a lovely weekend.